Good morning, everybody. There we go. Good. So before I start, I realize somebody came up to me and asked, well, you can talk about cloud computing. What is cloud computing? So how many people here think they understand what cloud computing is? That's good. That's more than most people. That's actually better than when I asked the IT folks, so that's a good sign. Just imagine you turned off the wireless connectivity on all of your machines. I see people with laptops, people with iPads, people with phones. Right? Everything you can't do the minute you turn off your wireless is what's happening in the cloud. Right? Exchanging the email, passing it through, processing information, every single thing we do. And so the cloud actually isn't all that new, but what is new is the explosion of information at a scale we've never seen before. I mean, my first job at Microsoft was help design Windows Update. People use Windows Update and variants of that to update their machines. And we were really excited because we pushed through 75 megabits of updates in the first day. We do a couple terabytes every few seconds, right? So the world has changed radically in the 12 years since this has started to happen. And the question is, what is its implication? And the first question is, well, why does Microsoft think about cloud computing in the context of environmental sustainability? And the answer is, what it says here is, this is a long cycle innovation problem, right? And if you look at other areas that Microsoft has invested in over the last 20 years, things like healthcare, patient record information, processing of data, better analytics, communications at scale, entertainment, the move into Xbox, TVs, all sorts of stuff that we're doing there. Certainly in education, radically changing the way people get information. All of these things are not 1 or 2 year projects. They're generally not products. We have some healthcare products, but these are underlying societal trends in which massive amounts of data and massive amounts of applications need to be built on platforms, and those platforms need to change. So my role at the company as the chief environmental strategist is, one of the things I get to do is think about, well, how does technology fundamentally change the way we use resources and the way we think about this problem? So the other thing to think about is, well, what are the tools that we bring to the situation? People tend to think of Microsoft. You know, you've got Exchange and Office and SharePoint and Windows. But that's a part of the story, but it's not really the whole story. And so when we think about how do you apply technology at a scale that's never been applied to this problem before, what are the assets that we're thinking about using here? And it's a couple things. The first thing is you have to think about performance and unlimited storage. Today, many universities around the world cannot address environmental issues because of one fundamental problem. They don't have computing capacity. They're running out of computational capacity to do the things that they think are really interesting. One of the things we have is we have many data centers all around the world, and we have massive amounts of capacity. And what happens when you actually think about hardware and unlimited storage and unlimited processing? How do you apply processing power in new and interesting ways? You know that most climate models take upwards of a month to run? Right? We think that actually, and we're working on driving that down to hours or days. The amount of data that gets processed is really hard, and you have to think about that. And so this is one of the things that being one of the largest data center operators in the world that we get to actually learn and experience. The second area, which is cloud computing, which I think spans across all this, is digitizing of information. There's lots of analog information that's out there. We've got to turn this into digital information, and we've got to process it in new ways. So turning all of this stuff, and I'll talk a bit about this in a few minutes, around taking disconnected data and adding it together. This next issue, actually, I think is probably one of the least understood and most underestimated issues in the battle against climate issues and environmental degradation around the world. It is too hard. If we think that we're going to change society, like, you're an interesting subsection of a very small group of people who are super passionate about this subject. The fact that you chose to take 2 days out of your schedule to come here to listen to a bunch of people talk about the problem and to meet other people means you're really interested in the problem and you really want to solve it. And so you're probably likely to do things like take 2 days out of your life to go address this issue and think about it really hard. But with 6.7 billion people on the planet, many of whom are just trying to survive, if we don't actually embed this into the way society works and the fabric of our ecosystems, we will not succeed. And part of what that means is actually making it invisible. It's intuitive natural user interface. How many people here used to do a lot of programming of their VCRs? Wow, that's a lot. How many people use like a TiVo or digital TV or HDTV programming and Hulu and all that, right? It's way easier. You point, you click, you sit on the couch, or you sit in your chair, and off you go, and you're off to the races. That's because of the user interface. It's fundamentally very different and simple, right? We're doing a lot of work with Johnson Controls. I'll talk about this in a few minutes, which is you can actually run around and turn down thermostats and do all that stuff. I do that, right? But really what you want is you want it to happen automatically, right? You want it to be embedded so that when you walk out of the room, the temperature goes down, you walk in, it goes up, or vice versa. You know, the thing I always talk about it, why is it that my phone, which I carry, actually knows I'm standing on this stage? My office doesn't, and my house doesn't. It's kind of weird. So I'm heating 3 spaces today, my home, my office, and here, and then the hotel room I was just in, 4 spaces. Right? That needs to be invisible. And the last thing is about broadband and mobility and devices. You need the information wherever you need it. You can't have this concept that I have to be hooked up to something anymore. I think that the society is moving there fairly rapidly. So when we think about the problem, we think about it in 3 primary dimensions for Microsoft. How do we enable radical energy efficiency at scale in and through the use of information technology? How do we accelerate, Joel talked about this, research breakthroughs? And then how do we make sure we're doing the right things in our own environment? And all of these are related. So the first thing is Microsoft as a company, we emit over 1 million tons of carbon. And we're trying to figure out how to drive that down, and it comes in 3 areas: air travel, buildings, and data centers. I'm not going to talk much about air travel other than to say by encouraging our employees to use more of our own telecommunications software and by taking away a lot of their budget to buy airline tickets, we were able to reduce 30% per person the amount of travel they did. That's a way of leveraging technology. In our building space, with a bunch of partners, and I called out Johnson Controls, and we're working with them in a couple of places around the world, we have over 100 countries that we operate in and over 500 buildings around the world. We're a big landlord. This is a big problem. We can't expect people to actually manually address this problem. Everything needs to be hooked up and wired up. And so we're working on some multi-year projects where the goal is basically to make it invisible and reduce the amount of energy we use in our buildings by upwards of 20% through the use of information technology. This is the other big area where we have a lot of energy use. People know what this is. This is the cloud. Right? I was at a vendor a couple of weeks ago. I saw 7,000 servers, processors, in a space not much more than from maybe here to where the end of the couch is, from the front of the stage probably to the right behind the screen. 7,000 servers using over 1 megawatt of capacity of power. These things are exploding. And the problem that we have and the challenge is, how do we triple, quadruple the amount of transactions we can do for a given unit of energy within the next decade? And we think we can easily do that if we get after the problem in an intelligent way. So with that, I'd like people to say I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. Anybody know what this is? This is the data center of the future. So what this is a data center is historically been a big concrete building that you shove a bunch of servers in, and you shove a bunch of connectivity and water and cooling and power. So one of our engineers said, wait a second, why do I have to be in a building? Right? Concrete takes a lot of energy actually to make. It takes about a ton of carbon to make a ton of concrete. So he went to Home Depot and he bought a tent. And he put a bunch of servers outside in the tent. And he experimented with this. And he said, I'm going to run a bunch of services for a year and see what happens. A couple of leaves got in the servers. Literally had to clean out some leaves. Right? Ran in Seattle where the moisture is probably pretty high compared to most places. And he realized, you know what? We can change the face of computing so that we don't have to use buildings. So this is what comes of that experiment. These are data centers of the future. They're called IT packs. They're mobile packs. And you literally vent the air outside. And you can see when I talked about 7,000 servers, there are a lot of servers here. So the cloud is fundamentally shifting the way it operates. The challenge still is high inefficiency. And so I won't talk about it today, but I spent a lot of my time talking to IT professionals about how unbelievably inefficient they are. They use a very small percentage of the amount of computing capacity of the machines. They have too many machines. They keep them too cold. They put them in old-fashioned buildings. And so by the time you actually get from power source to computation, we think that it's about less than 10% of the energy that actually is used, that's created, is actually used for computation. So this is a big problem for our industry, and we're working on this. The real question, though, is what do you do with the data center? What do you do with the power of the cloud? So this is an example of a bunch of kids in Australia doing something I think is really, really creative, which is, well, if I have this idea of cloud computing where I can take all this data from all these different places, how can I apply it to a real-world problem? 70% of all water in the world is used for agriculture, and probably 50% is wasted. In India, they've had over 1 million wells go dry in the last decade. 1 million wells. Because they flood the fields. Right? Well, if you take a step back and you go, well, what do I know with information that a cloud can help me with? You say, wait, I know exactly what varietal of seed I'm planting. Every seed is marked, right? Every type of seed is marked. Once I know that, I know exactly how much moisture, how much fertilizer, right? Nitrogen, phosphorus, all these things I need to grow my plant at optimal moisture. So I know when to water. If I put a bunch of sensors in the ground, I can actually say, well, I'm going to water this field today and that field tomorrow. But then you actually know a bunch more stuff, too. You know that if the ideal moisture is supposed to be 60% for your seed this week, and it's at 61%, you might be tempted to water unless there's an 80% probability of rain in the next 48 hours. Another piece of data sitting on the cloud is our weather data. And so now all of a sudden you say, wait, I actually have 2 or 3, this farm had 3 sources of water. Which source do I take from? Right? By putting a bunch of solar sensors in the ground and just having literally a phone, this farm was able to save over 50% of its water just by using the cloud. The other thing they could do is they could know when to harvest. Right? Because you could harvest today, tomorrow, or the next day, right? There's a window when you can harvest. You want to harvest when you know you can actually sell and get the ideal yield financially. So you're hooked up to a financial system. So here's just one example. A bunch of kids in Australia put this together. They entered this competition with literally 200,000 other students around the world that's called the Imagine Cup that we run every year. And this is the solution, and it won the Imagine Cup 2 years ago because we thought, wow, this is an incredibly interesting way of mashing up data and using solar-based network sensors to change the way agriculture can be done and should be done around the world. Right? So that's one industry. Another industry, an example, is in the energy industry. All of this data needs to be connected in new and interesting ways. Right? If you're going to run a power plant of the future, you've got to go from managing 40 sources of power to 400,000 or even 4 million. If you think that every light switch and every light bulb is actually going to have a sensor and be connected to your house in an intelligent way, you have to manage millions of pieces of information if you're a power company of the future. This is like the IP protocols. We call them EP, right? Electric protocols. This is a new way of thinking about the problem. Again, cloud computing, managing devices at a scale we've never seen. Here's another example for consumers. I love the last set that Michelle just did, right? Talked about a bunch of students looking at the problem of air toxicity, a major problem for our society that most people don't realize because you can't see it, right? If I actually showed you the air quality in this room, there's a spectrum analysis, you'd be shocked at what's in the air right now. Shocked. But you can't see it. Those kids were trying to say, look, I'm going to show you what you can't see, and I'm going to have a bunch of kids show you a video. We're trying to do the same thing in Europe, right, which is this thing called Eye on Earth, which is, again, a mashup in the cloud of on-the-ground sensors, historical data, and maps that says air quality and water quality real time. Seems kind of interesting. Asthma rates in Europe have almost doubled in the last 20 years. If you have a kid who is an asthmatic or you're an asthmatic yourself, this isn't kind of interesting information. This fundamentally changes the way you're going to live because you realize that it's not safe to go outside today. Right? These are the kind of breakthroughs that we got to get through technology where you take information that sits in spreadsheets in somebody's science office that takes a year to process and you make it real time. Somebody goes to a map, they enter their address, and they know the air is either good or it's bad. These are kinds of transformations we need everywhere in society. Cars. Everybody's excited about the electric car, except maybe the power company who realizes at 5 o'clock, everybody's going to drive home, it's going to be 98 degrees, they're going to plug in their electric vehicle, and the whole grid's going to fall over. So we're working on this problem as well. We have a joint venture with Ford to look at how do we actually manage power so that doesn't happen. Really what you want to do is you want to download the power when it's really cheap and it is already being wasted. A lot of people realize that wind power gets wasted at night, it gets dumped because there's not enough demand. We can actually help control demand with technology. Tools for scientists. We have this thing where you can go layer millions of pieces of data around the planet, around the solar system. We call this Worldwide Telescope. We're actually turning it back in on the Earth now and calling it the Worldwide Microscope. right? How do you drill down layers of information on oceans, on land, water systems, all of this stuff around the world? So I'll leave you with this last thought because I'm running a little over, which is creating green solutions implies that the problem claiming to be solved is known. We think we know a lot about carbon, right? This is a map of carbon and how it looks all over the world. And we know things like we can predict there's going to be forest fires and that's going to add carbon to the atmosphere. But the reality is we know almost nothing about carbon cycles. How much carbon was released in the typhoons and the floods in Queensland? Anybody know? Nobody knows. We do know that when you till soil, it actually emits more carbon than when you don't. And if you bury char, it actually sequesters carbon in the soil. Right? We have no idea what's happening to the carbon cycle, really. We think we know, right? So we run around with maps like this and say, hey, we know what's going on, but we don't. And what's happening is we're seeing land drying out, carbon release, and the problem then becomes more complicated from a data perspective, again, where we think about the cloud is, it's not just about carbon. It's about world population. It's about pollution. It's about species extinction, the increased pathogens and the disease pathways that are going to increase as temperatures increase. And it's about the fact that we're not harvesting the resources we have now in a sustainable way. And guess what? Our margin for error is like this, right? Because we don't understand what we're doing yet. And so you add all these things together and we have a very scary situation. And what we look at is, well, how do you drive impact? We know these things. And this is my challenge for you to think about, not just today, but in everything you do. So we do research, we develop products, right? We do new partnerships. I didn't talk a lot about them, but we're working with NGOs, we're working with partners here, we're working with partners all over the world. But this is the hardest part. How do you communicate these things? Because without good communication, we don't have impact. Right? This is great. I get to talk to people who are really passionate, like I said at the beginning. The problem is communicating to everybody at scale. You know, I see Mark's back in the corner. He's going to blog and write, and he's got some good viewership, and Joel's got good readership. We need more. And this is a major problem. I have it with just one small segment, IT professionals. Used to be I could go get an article in CTO magazine, and I could be confident that most of the people would read it, and that would drive impact. This is the reality today. Right? This is a real challenge. We have to get our voices heard. You have to get the work that you're doing, right, heard at a level that it's never been heard before. And I love the last presentation because a lot of this power is in our kids. Give them crowdsourcing. Give them things like YouTube. Give them the opportunity to post stuff. Let it go viral. Try to push. The challenge is, of course, in a world of a million or hundreds of millions of voices, it's really hard to rise above the clutter. And I think, when I think about the challenges we have, and I have in my role, and there are a lot of them, it's not about IT technology. There's amazing stuff that can be done, and I see it every day. It's not about real-time monitoring systems. There's great stuff being done right now. The problem is getting people to understand it and change their behavior at scale. I think that is the single biggest challenge we all face in this room. And I think the cloud is probably the key enabler to distribute information at a scale and a speed that we've never seen before. And so the challenge for us is to figure out how to leverage it effectively and quickly because we really don't have much time. So I think the cloud will change every single thing we attempt to do, and it's our opportunity and obligation to figure out how to leverage it. Thank you.